moving to our next expert, Dr. Repaul Kanji. Uh, he is a computer scientist at heart and a disaster risk management professional. He prefers to call himself part academician and part practitioner. Currently, works with Government of Gujarat at Gujarat Institute of Disaster Management as a research scientist and program manager. He also has the additional charge of research officer at SARC Disaster Management Center. And academically, he is associated as a young scientist with integrated research on disaster risk, which is a transdisciplinary research platform of International Science Council on the United Nations Office for DRR. And he is the founding member of the National Platform for Youth and Young Professional of India, working in disaster risk management and climate change adaptation. And he will be enlightening us on the role of youth for disaster risk management. Over to you, sir.
Thank you to the National Institute of Disaster Management and the Rajiv Gandhi National Institute of Youth and Development for giving this opportunity. And for me, it's actually a pleasure and an honor to share space with Professor Surya Prakash and Mihir sir, and share a few of my experiences, which probably will highlight how youth can be tagged as assets of disaster risk reduction. So I have few points of importance to share, and I will do so through a presentation. If you can just confirm if my screen is visible, and then we can go about it.
Yes, your screen is visible.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So I will be talking about youth as future assets in disaster risk reduction. Now, if you have marked my title of the presentation, I have a question mark that ends at the sentence. So because I have my own sets of doubts as in how we can utilize youth as future assets. So throughout the presentation, we will be talking about key points about my experiences and some examples. And then possibly we will be looking at certain strategies by which we can actually make youth the future assets in disaster risk reduction. So the context has been very well said by Mihir sir as he was talking about the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. Now, it is very important that we understand that slowly there is a global consensus, there is a global understanding that we should move from the era where we are more used to managing disasters to an era where we start managing disaster risks. Now, there is a very, very vivid difference of understanding in how we manage disasters and how we should manage disaster risk. And it was also pointed out by Mihir sir that this particular change or shift in paradigm has been brought about by the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. If I am to add, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction is an agreement to which 187 countries agreed to in 2015. And they set down certain guidelines or certain a framework of sorts that is supposed to be followed by all those 187 countries till 2030. So it's very, very important in that way. And since it is one of those guiding principles that a nation should follow, the guiding principle itself tells us that we should move from managing disasters towards managing disaster risk. Now, who is supposed to bring about this change in shift from managing disasters to managing disaster risk? Now, if you go back to what Professor Surya Prakash just said in his special address, he pointed out that no segment in the society can match with the power, the idealism, the enthusiasm and courage of a young person, right? So it is very important that we understand that youth of this nation, of course, and also globally, has a huge role to play in fostering this change from managing disasters to managing disaster risk. But as I pointed out, that I have my doubts of my own. Now, what you see on the screen is a dossier from a government department, which kinds of tried to identify the role of youth or volunteers for that matter in case of a disaster response, right? So they are expecting youths to do certain duties which pertains to telephone exchange, hospitals, first aid centers, assist civil defense workers, search and rescue, salvage operations. Now, I do not have any reservations in these roles which have been defined for youth and volunteers. But what I have a reservation is about these all activities being very, very response centric and very, very reactive. I do not agree to the idea where youth should be only used towards disaster response in a very, very reactive fashion. All our speakers before me have very clearly highlighted that the role of youth and volunteers may probably be explored in a very wide fashion. And we should see throughout this presentation how that can be done. But for that to happen, we need to understand that youth exclusively does not mean volunteers. It does not mean NCC cadets. It does not mean people who are enrolled in NSS. It's not just them. When we are talking about youth, we have to talk about all these people plus those who are also working in different sectors, who are engaged in different sectors. I'm talking about those who are working professionals, right? They also have a role in disaster risk management. Probably we do not understand how they fit in the entire scheme of things, but they do. And that is how the mere role of youth in response and reactions to a disaster can be converted to an scheme of things where we are looking at managing disaster risk. Right? So what is the contemporary understanding of youth and youth in disaster risk management? So let us start with something that we have already saw, the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. Now, this particular guideline says, this framework says that we have to shift from managing disasters to managing disaster risk that we have already discussed. It says that managing disaster risk is the business of all of the society and all of its institutions. It's just not about the government. It's not just about the NGOs. It's not about the community-based organization. It's the duty, the responsibility of everyone in the society, right? So it's not about youth and volunteers only, also those young professionals who are working in different sectors and contributing in the entire process of disaster risk management in their own way. Now, the Sendai framework has been the guiding document of designing the National Disaster Management Plan of India, which was the first one to actually abide by the SFDRR, and it was published in 2016 and then again revised in 2019. So this is about the Sendai framework for disaster risk reduction. Now, what else do we have? We have the Sustainable Development Goals, which highlights 17 goals with 169 associated targets, out of which I believe that climate change adaptation and mitigation, the 13th goal probably is the most important, specifically when the 6th assessment report just came out a few days back, and it kind of reinforces the fact that humans have been the contributing factor towards climate change. So when we have been the contributing factor, it also lays a responsibility on us to think about its adaptation and think about its mitigation, right? And it specifically tells us the agenda, the sustainable development agenda specifically tells us that we should not leave anyone behind. So we are talking about all of the society approach with youth, young professionals, not only limited to volunteers, taking a torch-bearing role towards moving us from the era of disaster management to disaster risk management, right? The third important thing that I want to highlight at this point is the Prime Minister's 10-point agenda, which is basically an outcome of the Asian Ministerial Conference, and it was a 10-point that was laid down by our Honorable Prime Minister. I would specifically highlight point number 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, which kind of touches upon the idea of the role of youth in a very, very exaggerated manner, in a manner in which it should be probably. As Surya Professor just mentioned, that youth can play a good role in disaster risk assessment. So the fourth point actually highlights that we need a mapping of disaster risk, probably at the global level. But let's just start from our own level, from our communities. Now, out of the entire population of India, which section of the population do you think is more tech savvy, more used to social media? Of course, the youth. So they have an additional role of leveraging technology to enhance disaster risk management efforts, right? Social media. Now, probably you all have come across examples how social media can be utilized in DRM efforts during the COVID-19 situation. Network of universities, studies on lessons from disasters. So you see, all these are to be done by youth and young professionals who are not just volunteers, but they are people coming from different sectors. They're working in different sectors. For example, a researcher who is working in a university is also a professional, a young professional who is contributing to this particular field of disaster risk management in its own way, right? So the idea of limiting youth to volunteers only, or probably those who, kind of voluntarily do things, has to be shut down completely. And we will have to expand our definition, understanding, and interpretation of the word youth to include people of young professional, people who are young professionals too. So this being the contemporary understanding, let us explore the role of youth and young professionals beyond the status quo. When I say status quo, please go back to the image which I showed first, where the definition of roles and responsibilities of youth was very response-centric and very reactive. So what we will do is that we will talk about examples of youth and young professionals in accordance to the 4 priorities of Sendai framework. I've already explained how important this particular framework is, since the national plan is also based on this framework. So we will go one by one and understand examples of each of this priority. Now, I will not tell you examples which I have not myself been into or I have not encountered. So all these examples I will be sharing with you are from my personal experiences, and somehow I have worked in these kind of examples, right? So let's talk about the first thing, understanding disaster risk. But before that, what I want to critically emphasize is to understand the idea that disaster risk management is a transdisciplinary field, right? So it's not only about people who have a background in disaster studies who can come up and do a job in this particular field. People from different fields come together and work in disaster risk management. And that is what we will have to understand in all of these examples. I will show all these, however, through examples also. Now let's move to the first priority of Sendai framework, understanding disaster risk. Now, understanding disaster risk is completely different from understanding disasters. Disaster risk, by the essence of the term, is about understanding the probability or chance of a hazard like an earthquake or cyclone becoming a disaster. Now, this is very, very important. The understanding of this sentence is also very important. When I say hazard, I do not mean a disaster. For example, an earthquake or a cyclone or a tsunami is not a disaster in itself. It can become a disaster when the effects and impacts are beyond your coping capacity, beyond the coping capacity of the community, right? Before that, it's just a hazard. And understanding the risk which is posed by that hazard is understanding the effect, the possible effect and impact that hazard can actually lead to. So we will have to understand disaster risk. So what I'm talking about is about understanding the effects and impact of a hazard before the hazard even hits that community or the district or the state or the nation in case of COVID-19, right? So that is what is very important. I'm not talking about understanding disaster as such. Disaster is just a consequence. But what we are talking about here is about understanding disaster risk, which is the probability of something bad happening. So this is very crucial. Now let's understand this by examples from COVID-19. If you just go back and analyze all that things that have happened during COVID-19, what were the risks that we can actually think of? The first one, in the initial days, the first wave, the probable risk was of case surge, right? More and more cases were reported. So what is the problem there? The problem is that more and more cases reported and no one knows how to treat them. So everyone was actually being admitted to the hospitals and overwhelming of facilities to a point where there was actually no space. We have already seen how things were, right? So this was the first thing. The second risk was of death surge. Now people were not aware of how to treat that particular virus. Even now, it's not very clear, right? We do have vaccines, but a treatment, except the algorithm which was released by MOHFW, we do not have a very clear understanding of how to treat this particular virus. So this was actually leading to a high number of deaths, which we saw in the first wave as also in the second wave. So this is the second risk. And the third is actually a consequential risk that happened because of the other two risks. Because facilities were being overwhelmed, because of high number of deaths, the entire nation was into lockdown in the initial stage, and then we had sporadic and very area-specific lockdowns, which actually led to economic paralysis. Now try to understand. Now COVID-19 is of course a disaster, and there is no doubt about it. Now, if you are supposed to understand the risks that are involved in this particular thing, do you think that any one individual or a group of individuals coming from a single discipline can do this? Well, given my experience in the field and given my academic background, I do not think that this is possible by people coming from a single discipline. So let us understand this again through examples. I don't know if you have come across this particular portal. This is covid19india.org. And it was phenomenally used during the first wave, the second wave, to keep a track on the number of cases that were being reported, confirmed cases, active cases, recovered, deceased. Even before the MOHFW, that is the Ministry of Health and Family Welfare statistics, was published, these people came together and they built this particular site, right? And it is supposed to go down by October 2021. So this year it's going down. Now the problem is that this particular initiative, which gave us the case counts, the death counts, was actually the only source of data that were being used by researchers from all over the world. Now, given its news that it is going to shut down in October 2021, very eminent researchers, one of them, Brahma Mukherjee, I don't know if you have come across her, because she had played a very key role in kind of modeling the case surges during the first and the second wave. She expressed her disappointment that this particular portal is going down, right? And she also mentioned a very important thing here, that is, the noble and voluntary efforts should have been supported by the officials. I'll come back to the second point a little bit later. Now, this is another example that I want to point out. During the COVID first wave, what happened is that there was Amphan supercyclone, which probably every one of you know. Now, it's not only about risk assessments prior to the event. Even when there is even after an event, there should be a risk assessment, because if you know about Sundarban is basically a natural heritage area. So when people, when voluntary organizations, even when response forces come to this place for immediate rescue and relief, they probably can also destroy certain important cultural heritage aspects of these places. And it's very important, because I don't know if you realize this, once there is a disaster, the only thing people actually hold back onto for during the recovery are those cultural elements, right? So a situational analysis and initial needs assessment was prepared and it was circulated. Now, what I'm trying to point out is that in the first example that we saw in the COVID-19 India.org website, epidemiologists, public health experts, or students and computer scientists came together to make that entire website working, and they kept it working for a long 1.5 years, right? In this second particular example that I'm citing, cultural heritage professionals, humanitarian aid workers, and DRM professionals came together to make this one document. Now, if we go back to the first example, I highlighted that that researcher specifically mentioned that officials should have supported their endeavor. Now, this is an exception in this case. The second example, that this situational analysis report, is that we had a good network in this case. So once this report was prepared by us, we pushed it through our networks. We sent it to NDMA, we sent it to NDRF, and we did a good job, a relatively good job, a better job, right? So what I'm trying to focus here is the idea that when we talk about youth and them being the assets in disaster risk reduction, we'll have to understand that these people will come from different sectors. They will come from different walks of life, and they will come together to work towards disaster risk reduction. And it's not only about risk as in pre-event, but also in cases where the event has already occurred and you need a very quick situational analysis, a rapid needs assessment, that kind of a thing, right? Again, more things that a youth can actually do. Now, if you remember, when the first wave actually hit us, there was this continuous commotion that was going on. Ki flattening the curve kya hai? People were very, very afraid ki why we are being locked down, why we are not being allowed to go home. In the urban setting, probably you have not had that particular experience of how bad it can be. But once you have been in the rural areas and you have heard stories of the rural areas, you would be actually very surprised to know that people reacted very badly to that, right? So there was this initiative by people, actually from students from IIT Roorkee, who came together and they did a very, very simple desk-based research as to why flattening of the curve is important, right? And they translated the entire understanding in a very, very lucid word, in very lucid statements, and that too in different languages. So one was in English, one was in Hindi, one was in Assamese. And in each of these videos, they were trying this very simple thing, small videos, and they were then circulated on WhatsApp that, see, this is why uh, flattening the curve is important. This is why you are being locked down. There's nothing to be worried about. There is nothing horrific about this. It's the usual process. We are learning, and these are examples that we are bringing on from our last experiences of a pandemic, that is the Spanish flu. So entire thing, the entire academic research was converted into simple narratives, small videos, and they were circulated. And this again is a very important role of youth and young professionals, where they come in and play an important role of myth busting, explaining things which are very, very technical to people, to normal people who generally do not understand this, right? So this is another example. Now, as I was saying that people from every walks of life or every discipline may come in. So this is the earthquake hazard map of Bihar. Now I have this junior of mine who is a civil engineer, and he came up with this kind of a risk assessment on his own. So he basically divided the entire state into different zones of intensity and tried to calculate how many numbers of houses and lives would be lost depending upon the grade of damage. It's very technical. That is not my point of argument here. What I'm trying to convey is that that civil engineer probably has no idea of how the entire mechanism of disaster risk management works. But he is skilled enough to understand his own field, his own subject, that is civil engineering. He's aware how all this information of seismic intensity can be actually used to kind of quantitatively pull down how many houses are going to be damaged, how many lives are going to be lost. So now this civil engineer is also contributing to disaster risk management by way of assessing risk, right? So this was another example. Again, another example that I want to bring out is of, I don't know if you have heard about this, but during the second wave, many COVID support groups built up unanimously, autonomously, out of sheer volunteerism of people. Now, this one is from Gujarat. So this is the Gujarat COVID support group. Now, these people came together, and in the initial days, their only singular idea was to, kind of make remdesivir available, or, kind of facilitate the information and data of is hospital mein itne beds khali hai and all that kind of stuff. But eventually what happens is that one of them, who was basically a software engineer of sorts, he said, let's not do this like this. This is very mechanical process, and this takes a lot of time of us. So let's build a website. So this is a website that they came out with, and this was all done within a week's time, and people from all walks of life came together. We have public health experts in this group, we have RJs, radio jockeys in this group, and we also have software engineers like the fellow who built this. So this is one where which had information about medicines basically. This was another website which was built, which had information about the number of beds, number of hospitals, availability of oxygen, ICU beds, ventilators, etc. Reminding you again, this was done within a period of a week or two at the max. Now, let us go to the second priority of Sendai framework, which is strengthening disaster risk governance. And this is the most trickiest part. This is the most important part as well as the most trickiest part. Now, disaster risk governance has a very, very clear global understanding and interpretation, right? Totality of actors, rules, conventions, processes, and mechanisms concerned with how relevant risk information is collected and blah, blah, blah. So you can read that out. That's not important. A very simplistic deliberation on this is that application of the principles of governance to the identification, assessment, management, evaluation, and communication of risk. So basically what the definition is trying to tell you is that you have to apply governance principles into the idea of disaster risk management, right? So you do not have a separate branch of study or a separate field that talks about disaster risk governance. It's basically incorporation of the principle of governance into the established gamut of disaster risk management. Simple as that. But the problem is that the decision makers very often, and I am sure that all those of you who have had the opportunity of dealing with officials who are decision makers, they have this general attitude of saying, "Mujhe sab aata hai, main expert hu." They probably have only managerial experiences. They probably have experiences of governance of sorts, but they do not have the experience of disaster risk management. They do not have the experience of being a public health expert. They do not have experience of epidemiology. So they need people who are supposed to come from that field and tell them, and they will have to apply the principles of governance or principles of management on those advices. They are not the experts themselves. But this is what actually happens. And over a period of time, I basically have tried to figure out why this happens. Now, this is the Dunning-Kruger effect, and this is what actually happens. So when you know nothing about something, your confidence is very high. It's almost like, you have 10 chapters to finish before an exam and you only know 2. So you are basically sure कि इस 2 chapters से questions आएंगे तो मैं बता दूंगा. So you are very confident. But once you start studying and you see, अरे इसके आगे तो और 8 chapters है और 8 chapters में भी इतनी detail में जाना है, then you come down. Your confidence grows. Your confidence goes very, very down. And then when you actually start learning, it again goes up. So this is what the general scenario is. I'm not imposing this idea on anyone, but this is my personal experience of having worked with people at different levels. What is missing over the years that I found out is there is no proper DRM leadership. I'm not talking about leadership as in general. There are good leaders in general, but what I'm talking about is someone who has this enviable quality of being a leader and is also aware of DRM principles. That is actually missing. We do have exceptions and there is no doubt about it, but in general, it is missing. Willingness. Now, you can be in a decision-making position, but what happens is that usually people are not willing to do it. It's just like, कि हाँ ठीक है, but करना नहीं है. And the third most annoying thing that I've come across is that when you are actually dealing with youth and young professionals, you are bound to hear ideas which may sound crazy, which may be out of the box. And as a leader, as a boss, you are supposed to hear those ideas out and then convince or manipulate it as to how it can work. But this point of acceptance does not come because सामने वाला ये सोचता है कि how can someone else give me an idea? I am supposed to be the expert. मुझे सब आता है. How can someone give me an idea? So these are the 3 very, very important things that I personally felt missing, which kind of can help in strengthening disaster risk governance. Nevertheless, we do have good examples also. I do not know if you have heard about this, but you of course have heard about Arogya Setu. You may have heard about something called EthiHas, which works at the back end of Arogya Setu. I'm definitely sure you have not heard about Access. This is basically an application which is of similar sorts to Arogya Setu, and it was used in some of the districts in Gujarat. Now, it is a very, very simple principle behind it. What is the symptom of COVID-19? Bukhar, right? And what happens? What is most prevalent in India? Agar bukhar hota hai, to the first thing anyone does is कि हम Prosin ले लेते हैं, paracetamol ले लेते हैं, Dolo 650 ले लेते हैं, right? So over the counters drug we purchase very, very prevalently in India. Now, depending on this very small principle, one young professional who is also a public health expert, with support from good leaders who were willing to accept his idea, developed this application. इस application में one is not supposed to enter data as it was done by others. ऐसा नहीं था. This application was to be used by drug retailers, मतलब जो दवाई बेचते हैं. And if someone is buying any medicine which kind of fits into the symptoms of COVID-19, they are supposed to take track of the person who is buying it, keep a record, and then the local health center जो होगा, जो भी public PHC होगा, some of the health workers would go there and check. अगर symptoms अगर होते हैं कोविड जैसा, तो then they will be admitted and the proper treatment जो भी scenario बनता है, so that would be followed, right? So even before one was actually, being diagnosed or tested through RAT or RT-PCR, just by the voluntary action of a person कि थोड़ा बुखार सा लग रहा है, चलो पैरासिटामोल ले लेते हैं. Based on this very simple principle, this person developed this application, and it had a very, very good success rate. And this initiative was taken by a young professional. We very limitedly assisted him, but yes, this was done by someone very young. And luckily, he was supported by the leadership. He was supported by his boss. So this actually worked out. Moving on, I have another example to share with you. So my institute, where I come from, the Gujarat Institute of Disaster Management, we during the COVID times, of course, everyone knows that every training was actually cancelled and only webinars were happening. So we thought that why can't we prepare a small course of some sorts and then make it available to anyone? So you sit back in your home and do all your work, and when you are free, you log on to this and you go through the course. So it's basically an online free self-paced course. So we designed the course, we made it internally, everything was done, and then we took help of the National E-Governance Department, and we said that, look, we have this brilliant course that we have developed. Can you please host it on your system so that everyone can access it? And they said, yes, why not? Perfect. So this is the course we had on the National E-Governance Department's learning management system, right? So all hunky-dory, perfect. Now, this is the daily report of the course. So on the 13th of August, that is 2 days back, we have 14,933 registrations of this course, and only 40% people had completed this course. Now, we were literally very shocked. Why is this happening? We are offering this course for free. We are making it available to everyone, and we have used the simplest of language possible to kind of explain the entire realm of disaster risk management. So what is the problem here? So then we went back and we started assessing. We saw that the maximum number of registrations are coming from the state of Gujarat, because we wrote letters and we tried to circulate this offering to people in Gujarat. So now, the people from Gujarat, they are not very comfortable. Those who were registering were not very comfortable with English language. So first or the second video or the second module, they were going through and they were saying, "Yaar, ye to humse nahi hoga," and therefore the completion rate is so low. So we said, no, this is a good course, no doubt, but let's make it vernacular. Let's try to explain disaster risk management to everyone, but in a language that they understand. So we redesigned the entire course and made it in Gujarati. And then again, we thought, should we put it up on NEGD? Now, NEGD is exclusively made for the government departments. So a normal person would not generally be knowing that what is going on there. But there is another similar kind of a platform which is known as Diksha, and it is very well known in the education sector, because many courses of different classes are actually being run on Diksha portal. So we said that, see, it's better that we launch this Gujarati course on Diksha, and so every student, every teacher who is actually on this platform, they have already registered on this platform, can quickly get access to this, and let that course be in Gujarati. So we designed this Gujarati course, and this is our course on the Diksha portal. And see the great change that we just experienced. we have 1,47,649 registrations with 85% completion rate. And now the question is, how did this happen? It's very simple. This is how the existing structure of governance was being used to strengthen the understanding of disaster risk management. So this is a letter which was sent out from the education department in Gujarat, saying that all teachers who are already registered on Diksha portal should go through the course. And this is the result. Looking at this, another letter was issued by the Department of Health and Family Welfare, saying that these officers like CHOs, THOs, and AHS must go through the course. Now, what I'm trying to explain here is the idea that in this case, we were lucky. This entire idea of preparing a course, designing a course, thinking out of the box, right? Making it as crisp as possible, as lucid as possible, easy to understand as possible. This was done by a group of young professionals, like I was also a part of it, right? But this idea received acceptance from someone who is my boss. So he willingly accepted the idea and he helped us. So our idea was great in terms of everything, but it would not have succeeded if my boss was not willing to support this idea. So in disaster risk governance, when we are talking about strengthening disaster risk governance, of course, again, people from different sectors, different walks of life, different disciplines will come in. But at the end of the day, to kind of incorporate the idea of risk-informed development or disaster risk management, we will need good leadership who are willing to do and those who accept the ideas, right? So this was example. Another example that I want to cite is that of this person. I don't know if you have seen him, but he is actually the collector of Nandurbar district in Maharashtra. Now this person's what he did was he set up oxygen plants. And I think many of you have known, you may have already known this particular incident that I'm talking about. I want to focus on very important thing that this person, although the district collector, has a background, has a medical degree actually. So even before the first wave was coming to an end, he could probably understand that risk that eventually when the second wave hits, there will be a dearth, a shortage of oxygen, and we need to prepare right now, right? So this is a step of risk management that is coming from the core mechanism of government. The other examples were when we were pushing our ideas into the government, into the established mechanism of governance, and this is something that is coming from the governance itself. Now, I want to point out one very important thing, that is that this particular article that I was referring to, it says that in terms of bureaucratic hierarchy, it is said that if district collectors take the lead, it should not be difficult to tackle the shortage. This is because they have huge funds at their disposal. Now, very interesting is the fact that if these young professionals, I am saying that this particular person who is a district collector is also a professional of sorts, right? So any district collector who actually joins as a supernumerary assistant collector and then becomes an assistant collector and then district collector. Now imagine if they are also trained with the ideas, the fundamentals of disaster risk management. If someone is there to train them about the Disaster Management Act. Now the Disaster Management Act already gives all the collectors in entire nation the power to do anything that is actually needed to kind of prevent or mitigate a disaster. The act gives the collector the power, and this matched against the collector manual which is available, actually a district collector can do it. So what I'm trying to convey here is that even these young professionals, young district collectors, young IAS officers, young All India Services officers, young Central Service officers, they are also not beyond the realm of young professionals. They also do need a very fundamental, if need be very fundamental, but they also need a training of how disaster risk management is actually happening in India. If not the entire realm or entire subject of it, but at least those important parts, like how you can, kind of use or leverage the Disaster Management Act, the National Act, the State Act, if the state has one, how to operationalize the state plan. So all these different aspects. So they are also within the realm where they need to be trained. Okay, moving on to the third pillar of the Sendai framework, that is investing in disaster resilience. Now, investment in disaster resilience is about investing in all dimensions to foster the prospect of disaster resilience. Now, this is another common problem that I have seen happens, is that we use the term resilience very, very loosely, very interchangeably, very synonymously. If you do not trust me, go back and do a small research on how the term resilience has evolved and was incorporated in the field of disaster risk management. You will see that it has an origin in Latin, and how it has traveled from different disciplines, ecology, physics, to finally being accepted in disaster management, that too with different caveats, right? So we generally use the word resilience, resilient very casually, very loosely, but it is a huge concept. It is a huge concept, and there is a lot of understanding that needs to go behind it. So when we talk about investment in disaster resilience, it is in all aspects that can foster the idea of disaster resilience. Now, of course, there is investment by the government. Like at the national and the state level, there are different types of projects. We have National Cyclone Risk Mitigation Project, National Seismic Risk Mitigation Project. There are organizations like the Coalition for Disaster Resilient Infrastructure, huge funding, huge investment going in for disaster resilience. But we are here to talk about the role of youth and young professionals in investing in disaster resilience. Now, being youth and young professionals, think a little out of the box. I will say, think entrepreneurship, right? So, with the evolution that is happening in India, with more clarity and more easeability in terms of doing business, many startups are coming up, and they are again from different sectors. So their investment in a way can also cater to disaster risk management and finally foster disaster resilience. I will give you an example. So this is a very small organization, Risk and Resilience Institute. They somehow managed to gain certain funds from an international organization, which is the UNESCO's capacity building wing, and they put out a project which is known as Milijuli. Now, what is different about Milijuli? It was basically a 4 months long project during COVID-19 lockdown period. So basically, no one was going out of their houses, right? And they were supposed to document stories of resilience from the far reaches of Assam, like from communities in different districts of Assam, where people generally do not go. So that kind of thing. And it was very intentionally done that in this particular project, no experts were hired. Students were taken from local universities and local colleges. They were made to understand what disaster risk management is, how it matters, how it functions. So by the time this 4 month period ended and the final product came out, this 10-16 students who were in their bachelor's or somewhere in the master's, they had this capacity, they had their capacity developed. Now they were in a better position to understand what actually disaster risk management is. If this particular organization had hired experts, this would not have happened. But through this project, through this particular investment that was brought in, these students were also trained. So now one can proudly say that there are at least 16 people in Assam who are aware of the contemporary understandings of disaster risk management, right? Again, what is so special about these stories of resilience? Risk perception. I remember there was this dialogue in the beginning of this, in the beginning of my session when people were talking about floods and all. So see, risk perception matters a lot. Flood in my context, in an urban context, is a problem, right? Office kaise jaunga, ghar se kaise niklunga, and all that kind of stuff. But flood in a rural context is completely different, because if you go to certain villages in Assam, you will see that they are super excited to have floods. Why? Because flood brings them mud becomes clay, and clay becomes more pottery becomes more economy for them. Flood means fresh fishes means more food, and fresh fishes also mean good selling opportunities and all that. So risk perception, is very important. So these stories of resilience captured this. They were almost like, you know, a knockback on your head. See that to all those students who were in the urban setting, to see that जो तुम flood बोलते रहते हो कि बहुत ही chaotic है, it's not always like that. There are people who actually are thriving on flood, right? So this was one aspect. The second is indigenous knowledge and practice. All of you must have noticed that कि धीरे धीरे जो generation बढ़ रहा है, we are losing touch from what is indigenous to us. We are more tech savvy. We have moved more towards the social media. जो हमारे actual practices हैं, उनसे हम काफी दूर आ चुके हैं. So this was again a reminder from everyone कि see, there are people who are still holding on to their indigenous knowledge, indigenous practices, which are actually risk informed. They are developing, but in a sustainable manner. They grow their own food, they are living on their food, they are selling their food, and they are just sailing through. This is very important. The third aspect the stories of resilience highlighted is that generally what happens in our field, when we say community-based disaster risk management, the first idea, the first image that strikes us that it is in a rural setting. Actually, no. CBDRN can also be done in an urban setting. And this, again, was a case that the stories of resilience brought out. And youth and young professionals, being youth and young professionals, they did it very differently. They said that let's not write articles, let's not write research papers. Let's change the entire thing into narratives. Let stories speak themselves. Let us make a comic out of it. If you make an article, if you write a research paper, it will be read by only 100, 200, max 300 people, right? But if you make a comic and then you circulate it in let's say schools or local universities, imagine how effective it would be. These were all of the things that were being done in a single project through investment. And now I leave it to you to understand how all these things will actually help in building resilience, right? So I will show you another example of how investment in disaster resilience is. Many of you probably may have heard about the idea of making disaster management plans, right? And generally disaster management plans, making them requires a lot of money because a lot of task actually goes into it. Hazard risk vulnerability assessment takes a lot of time, lot of resources, and hence a lot of money. So that there is no argument there. Now, this organization that I know prepared a disaster risk management plan for a thermal power plant. And this was very different from the usual risk management plans that you generally see. When you Google disaster management plan or disaster risk management plan, you will see a very contemporary, a very, usual setting of this comes before this, this comes before this, and then there at the end, there is a list of contacts, and this is how you go about it. So these people, this is basically a startup of young people, and I'm also kind of I'm part of this initiative of theirs. So what they did is that they made a disaster risk management plan, which is evidence-based and simulation dependent, right? So they figured out what the hazards are, like earthquake or cyclone, and they ran simulations to figure out कि अगर यहाँ पे earthquake होता है तो कितना तेजी से जमीन हिलेगा. If there is a cyclone, कितने तेजी से wind speed होएगा. So this is the detail that they went into. And now you have to imagine that for this to happen, there will be a person who is a seismologist or an earthquake engineer who can do that. There also needs to be someone who is a hydrometeorological hazard expert, जो कि cyclone की simulations run कर सकते हैं. So again, people from different backgrounds are being brought together to understand कि actually अगर ये hazard यहाँ होता है तो इसका intensity, इसका magnitude कितना होगा. This is something that you rarely will find in a disaster management plan because generally qualitative hota hai assessment, but these people did it very quantitatively. So this was one thing. Again, incident response system bhi ek cheez hoti hai. So I do not know if much of you are aware of it, but incident response system ko bhi bahut अच्छे से इस particular plan में integrate किया गया था. And again, the most important and very good point is that this was not left to a plan only. इस पर्टिकुलर एक्सरसाइज से, इस पर्टिकुलर प्रोसेस से जो भी लर्निंग था, these people actually took it out and made a research paper on it. So जो प्लान बना वो तो जिनके लिए प्लान था वो तो यूज हुआ ही हुआ. इनका जो लर्निंग्स था, द प्रोसेस दैट दे एक्चुअली वेंट थ्रू, कि कैसे हजार्ड का असेसमेंट करना है, कैसे रिस्क का असेसमेंट करना है, देयर इज अ लॉट ऑफ लर्निंग इन ऑल दिस. So being young professionals, they derived a research paper from it and they published it. तो चलो कम से कम 200-300 लोग जो भी इसको पढ़ेंगे, एटलीस्ट दे विल गेट एन आइडिया कि अगर उनको ये करना हुआ, they will be very prudent about this, right? So again, तो जो इन्वेस्टमेंट इसमें आया था कि लेट्स मेक अ DRM प्लान, तो इसमें भी आप you can be very very prudent about how you work, and you can be very very comprehensive and very very effective in the outcomes and the results. एक छोटा सा और एक एग्जांपल मैं देना चाहूंगा कि बहुत लोगों के अभी दिमाग में ये चल रहा होगा कि यार इन्वेस्टमेंट मिलना ही बहुत, फंड्स मिलना बहुत मुश्किल है, एंड देन मतलब इट्स वेरी डिफिकल्ट, राइट? आई डू अंडरस्टैंड दैट, एंड देयरइन आई वांट टू just put in this particular example. This guy who you can see in front of your screen is a friend of mine from Syria. So again, he had certain networks and he received a fund, and they actually worked towards rebuilding the cultural heritage sites in Syria. If you remember, I mentioned कि जब disaster recovery होता है तो generally जो indigenous people होते हैं, लोग जो होते हैं, they hold on to their culture, they hold on to the practices. और सीरिया में क्या हाल था, आई थिंक सबको पता ही होगा. एवरीथिंग वाज डिस्ट्रॉयड, सो दे हैड नो पर्टिकुलर पॉइंट की वेयर दे आर सपोज्ड टू होल्ड ऑन टू. मस्जिद सारे खत्म हो गए, द प्लेसेस वेयर दे यूज्ड टू हैंग आउट वो खत्म हो गए, तो लोग मिले कहां, बातें कहां से करें? तो एवरीथिंग वाज शैटर्ड. सो दिस पर्सन गॉट सर्टेन फंड्स, एंड इन दिस पर्टिकुलर कॉन्टेक्स्ट जहां पे गवर्नमेंट ही ठीक नहीं है, who is ruling whom, you will never probably know. वहां पे this person brought out a group of people to be trained about how to kind of recover the entire thing. तो आप देखो इसमें कितने ज्यादा टेक्निकल चीजें भी यहाँ पे पढ़ाया जा रहा है. and this person did it on a voluntary basis, खुद ही initiative लिया, and they are talking about building survey plans, they are talking about assessments and everything, and this is how the entire thing looks. And यहाँ भी they have this initiative of using technology to its best. So if you know this is basically 3D mapping कैसे होता है. So once a structure is brought down, you can do a 3D mapping just to understand कि इसको दोबारा कैसे बनाया जा सकता है. So this is how it is done. Okay, moving on to the last and probably I would say a very very important aspect कि enhancing disaster preparedness. मिहिर सर ने mention किया था build back better. जो पूरा का पूरा जो प्रायोरिटी है, इट इज लाइक एनहांसिंग डिजास्टर प्रिपेयर्डनेस फॉर इफेक्टिव रिस्पॉन्स एंड बिल्ड बैक बेटर. तो इट्स नॉट ओनली अबाउट इफेक्टिव रिस्पॉन्स, इट इज ऑल्सो अबाउट बीइंग प्रिपेयर्ड. ठीक है. सो व्हेन वी आर टॉकिंग अबाउट यूथ एंड यंग प्रोफेशनल्स और उनका रोल इन particularly in this particular pillar, what happens is these things. See, I am somehow in a position that I have an established career of my own. But there are people who are coming from my field, coming from different fields, who want to pursue disaster management, as in उनको careers बनाने हैं इसमें, या तो higher studies करने हैं. So it is again our responsibility to kind of orient them, also train them. So this was another initiative which I with along with some of my friends, we undertook this. Ki all those people who are trying to join our field, right, coming from different background, चाहे higher studies करना है, चाहे career देखना है, government में, NGO में, INGO में, what can be the ways? Masters करना है, PhD करना है, postdoc करना चाहिए भी या नहीं चाहिए? Is it actually worth it? Because once you do a PhD and then again you go about searching for job, makes no sense, right? So people are already there, young professionals, some of them have actually established themselves. So they have this responsibility to look down and tell their peers or juniors how this can be done. So that is also a way of preparedness. So what are the problems in the field? Academia or field ki divide itni zyada kyun hai? And the best part is ki when you start such a discussion, ideas click, and that is where innovation happens. You just can't wake up one morning and think कि चलो आज innovate करेंगे. It does not happen. When you talk to people coming from different fields, and they share their idea, they share their experiences, and you learn from them. That is when actually innovation happens, and that is the true transdisciplinary nature of this field, right? So apart from response which is already being done, क्योंकि response के लिए जैसे schemes हैं, आपदा मित्र है, बहुत ही बड़ा NDMA का project है, so it is already there. District level पे, state level पे जो authorities होते हैं, they also do this. So the preparedness in terms of response is already being done, right? जो आप लोगों को मैंने वो डॉसियर दिखाया था गवर्नमेंट का, so that response reactive, that is already being done, no issues with that. But उससे बढ़कर और हमें क्या करना है? So this is one way of doing it. The second thing is that, again, coming back to the idea कि youth and young professionals, they think out of the box. So when you are talking about response, effective response, how are you supposed to effectively respond जब आपने कभी वो hazard face ही नहीं किया है? How are you supposed to know कि earthquake में धरती कैसे हिलती है, right? So if you have this prior idea कि कैसे होता है, कैसे हिलता है, कैसे दिखता है, probably you would be in a better position to respond. तो इसके लिए there is a virtual reality thing that we developed, and we are also planning to take it another level higher to augmented reality. So you wear this this gadget, this eye gadget, and you are actually in the simulation. आप एक क्लास में होंगे, and you will see अचानक से earthquake होता है, तो how things happen, how you are given instructions कि now go inside, drop cover and hold कीजिए, don't panic, and all these kind of things, right? So this is very interesting, and this is another way how people are contributing. Now the person who developed this has no idea about disaster risk management, right? Now we had to orient them कि देखो ऐसे ऐसे होता है, and he used his own skill set of doing all this, virtual reality बनाना या this kind of thing. So both, again, दोनों field अलग अलग, दोनों field से लोग आए, and they made something very very interesting. Okay, so this would be my last request basically. ये last वो भी है, point भी है enhancing disaster preparedness में. This is basically a request that I want to make कि there is a growing consensus globally that disasters are not natural. हमें बचपन से यही पढ़ाया गया, there are two types of disasters, man-made or human-induced disasters, और एक natural disasters. But there is a growing consensus कि disasters are not natural. And this has been accepted by the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. This has been accepted by the International Federation of Red Cross and Red Crescent Societies कि disasters natural नहीं होते. There is a whole lot of research that has been done behind it, right? तो आइडिया क्या है? जो हम बोलते हैं ना डिजास्टर हिट हो गया, डिजास्टर्स डोंट हिट. हजार्ड्स जैसे साइक्लोन, अर्थक्वेक, दे हिट, एंड जो हमारे कम्युनिटीज में इनकेपेबिलिटीज है, वल्नरेबिलिटीज है, इनकैपेसिटीज है टू डील विद देम, दैट लीड्स टू द डिजास्टर, राइट? सो नेचुरल जब भी हम बोलते हैं ना डिजास्टर्स को, इट एक्चुअली डिपिक्ट्स हमारी हेल्पलेसनेस. Now youth and young professional का एक बहुत बड़ा रोल आता है to make people, to make the general masses understand कि there is nothing natural about disasters. We have our ways, we have our means to kind of reduce our vulnerabilities, increase our capacities so that hazards do not become disasters. जैसे कि मीर सर ने भी मेंशन किया था prevention and mitigation में, it is something of that sort. ये हमारे दिमाग में, हमारे साइकी में बैठ गया है कि डिजास्टर्स ऑफ टू टाइप, और नेचुरल डिजास्टर जैसे अर्थक्वेक हो गया, हम तो कुछ कर ही नहीं सकते. बट दिस इज रॉन्ग, राइट? अगर अर्थक्वेक को आप अच्छे से थोड़ा रिसर्च करो, यू विल कम अक्रॉस दिस स्टेटमेंट दैट अर्थक्वेक्स डू नॉट किल पीपल, बिल्डिंग्स डू, व्हिच इज एक्चुअली द केस, राइट? तो अगर बिल्डिंग्स के वजह से लोग मर रहे हैं, एंड वी आर अवेयर कि हम एक अर्थक्वेक प्रोन जोन में है, हमारी बिल्डिंग जो है इट्स नॉट very strong, it will not be able to resist this kind of an earthquake. Shouldn't it be our responsibility to work on that, right? उसके बाद अगर कुछ हो जाता है, बिल्डिंग गिर जाती है, then how are we supposed to say कि it's a natural disaster? हमारे आने से पहले भी earthquakes होती थी, और हम जब चले जाएंगे दुनिया से तब भी earthquakes होती रहेंगी, because it's a natural phenomena. तो हमने बिल्डिंग्स बनाई है, फॉल्ट लाइंस पे हमने बिल्डिंग बनाई है, और वो भी ऐसे बनाई है ताकि मतलब वो बस टिके ही ना. सो हाउ आर वी टैगिंग सच इवेंट्स एज नेचुरल डिजास्टर्स, राइट? और यूथ एंड यंग प्रोफेशनल का एक बहुत बहुत बड़ा रोल है कि ये मासेस तक लेके जाए. तो ये जो साइकी में बैठी हुई है ना हमारी हेल्पलेसनेस कि हम कुछ नहीं कर सकते, ये एटीट्यूड को खत्म करना है, और इसका भी रोल यूथ एंड यंग प्रोफेशनल्स का ही है. एक छोटा सा एग्जांपल देना चाहूंगा कि कैसे हमने ये किया. एक छोटी सी कोर्स चलाई थी हमने with 40 participants coming from different parts of India, and we had international participants also. और हमने कुछ 7 दिनों तक we discussed this कि disasters natural होती है या नहीं होती है. We had an elaborate discussion, and one of our participants who was very inspired by the idea, and he agreed to the मतलब basic fundamentals जो है, he agreed to it, and he came up with a meme video. बहुत ही इंटरेस्टिंग, मतलब यूथ एंड यंग प्रोफेशनल ऐसा करते हैं, मीम्स बना दिया, जोक्स क्रैक कर दी उसी तरह से. सो ही मेड अ मीम वीडियो and I put it up on my LinkedIn profile. And what happened is that within a day's time, I saw that professors, very esteemed professors in disaster studies, Ilan Kelmal, he's from University College London, then we have Kevin Blanchard. So ये बहुत ही बड़े बड़े लोग हैं disaster studies के फील्ड में. So they are also appreciating the fact that young people are coming together and they are fostering this idea that disasters are not natural. ये हटा देना है साइकी से हमें. We have to take our own responsibilities कि we know that this is a possibility, ये हो सकता है और इसके वजह से इसका इफेक्ट और इम्पैक्ट इतना गंदा होगा. So we have this upon us to reduce our vulnerabilities and increase our capacities. So final last slide, I think I have taken a little bit of more time than I was given, but this is my concluding slide. What I want to kind of leave you with is that 5 very important thoughts. Disaster management is not only a field of those who have a background in disaster management. It's not only a field of those who are coming from the background of governance or those who are in the decision-making power. It's a transdisciplinary field. We have to understand that we need everyone's hand on deck, everyone's help to kind of actually implement proper, effective disaster risk management strategies. It's very important. और innovation के लिए भी we need people from different disciplines to come and talk together. और तभी शायद हम सक्सेसफुली बोल पाएंगे कि डिजास्टर रिस्क मैनेजमेंट इज एवरीवन्स बिजनेस. नहीं तो क्या होगा कि सब अपने अपने तरीके से इसको करते रहेंगे. सो इवन इफ यू आर कमिंग फ्रॉम अ वेरी डिफरेंट डिसिप्लिन, मे बी यू आर अ स्टूडेंट ऑफ लेट्स से जर्नलिज्म, you have to understand your role कि आपका रोल क्या है. You have to report disasters correctly. ये disasters जो not natural जो है इसको समझिए. And if you feel that it is right, then it is your responsibility to foster this idea. आगे बढ़ाना है आपको, right? Now disaster risk जो है, अभी जितने भी स्टडीज हो रहे हैं, वी आर कमिंग टू एन अंडरस्टैंडिंग कि ये जो नेचर है ये सिस्टमिक है. मतलब एक से इफेक्ट होता है, दूसरे से इफेक्ट होता है, तीसरा, मतलब ऐसे करके सिस्टम्स जो है दे फॉल one on the other, जैसे डोमिनो इफेक्ट होता है. एंड देयर इमर्जेंट, मतलब वी एक्चुअली डू नॉट नो कि क्या हो सकता है, वेरी अनसर्टेन. तो ये ऐसा नहीं है कि मतलब हमें कुछ पता नहीं है तो हमें छोड़ देना है. So youth in disaster response is not the answer. We will have to use the potential of youth and young professionals to understand this systemic, this emergent, and this uncertain nature of risk, right? This is the second takeaway. The third, as I already have I have underlined quite a number of times, कि leadership, rational leadership, ऐसा नहीं कि leader बन गए बस, rational leadership, जिसको knowledge हो, जिसके decisions में logic हो, it's very necessary in this field. We do have people. Professor Surya Prakash is one of them. He has been immensely leaderly in his attributes. I have been in his touch from my IIT Roorkee days, so I know. So, but ऐसे लोग बहुत ही ज़्यादा कम हैं. Those who have this leadership qualities, those who are rational in their decision, right? Who can amplify the role of youth. ऐसा नहीं कि बस आप emergencies में response में लगा दो. Amplify करना है role का youth and not exploit them. Fourth is willingness of leaders. When you are working with youth and young professionals, you are supposed to get out of the box ideas, crazy ideas. And now it's the duty of the officials, the decision makers, the leaders to manipulate it, to mold it, to change it so that it becomes effective and efficient. Discard नहीं करना है, because जो सोच के आ रहे हैं, they also have a background. They also have an educational background or experiential background. ठुकराना नहीं है, उसको मैनिपुलेट करना है, उसको मोल्ड करना है, उसको चेंज करना है, सो दैट इट बिकम्स मोर इफेक्टिव. एंड दैट इज द रोल ऑफ लीडर्स. लीडर्स को दूसरे के फील्ड में नहीं घुसना है. लीडर्स को ये करना है कि दे विल हैव टू यूज देयर ओन एक्सपीरियंसेस इन मोल्डिंग द आइडियाज ऑफ पीपल हु ब्रिंग इट टू देम, राइट? और लास्टली जो मोस्ट इंपॉर्टेंट पॉइंट है इज कनेक्शन. फॉर एग्जाम्पल, आज का ही अगर हम वेबिनार देखते हैं, सो द राजीव गांधी नेशनल इंस्टीट्यूट ऑफ यूथ डेवलपमेंट इज कोलैबोरेटिंग विद NIDM. सो दैट्स अ कनेक्शन. अब यहाँ पे if there is someone who in this particular institute wants to work or wants to contribute, he can now collaborate with NIDM. So connections are very important. जैसे कि मैंने पहले बोला था कि वो जो हमने सिचुएशनल एनालिसिस का रिपोर्ट बनाया था, जस्ट बिकॉज वी हैड द कनेक्शन वी कुड पुश इट थ्रू टू NDMA NDRF. लेकिन वो जो कोविड-19 और जो कि हमारे रिपोर्ट भी काफी ज्यादा इम्पोर्टेंट था, it did not receive proper support. So there are many reasons कि क्यों support नहीं किया जाता है, and there's a lot of things, but the key point is कि there are 5 very important points that I'm trying to give you. I'm trying to leave you with these 5 very important thoughts, and it's up to you कि आपको इसको accept करना है, इसको आगे लेके जाना है. It's all up to you. So that would be from my side. Thank you for your time and attention, and thank you for giving me this opportunity to kind of talk to you. It has been a long monologue. I hope कि मैं ज़्यादा बोर नहीं. So I'm open to all questions, and over to you.